I've done a number of breakouts over the last several years at this conference. This is my first plenary, so I feel kind of like I've moved from the kids' table to the grown-up table at the holidays. So I want to walk you through a little bit of a different perspective on the DSCSA implementation that Peggy just shared with you. She talked to you about the challenges in the industry as we're looking at it from a manufacturer perspective. And I want to share with you a little bit about what it looks like in the middle of the supply chain as a distributor. So the DSCSA, there we go. One too many. That's sensitive. Okay. The DSCSA is a 10-year evolution as it goes through the U.S. supply chain. And roughly about every 2 years or so, there is a major migratory step as the requirements gradually increase, ultimately taking us to that point in 2023 where we have full serialization traceability, meaning that we're exchanging data every time a product is sold and moves through the supply chain from one partner to the next. Along the way, as we make these evolutions, some of the steps are more impactful to some of the trading partners than they are necessarily to others. Peggy talked a fair amount about the labeling that's coming up this year for the brand manufacturers and the generic manufacturers. Next year, there are labeling requirements for the repackagers and so on. And the distributors are on a slightly different timetable for some events that will happen. One of the uniquenesses that the distributors do face in the United States, though, is we are truly in the middle of the supply chain. So when you look at the data that we have to process through our systems, it's not only receive the data from the manufacturers about the products that they've created and passed to us, but we also have a publishing interest in being able to send data down to our ultimate customers below us. So we have to go both on an in and an out basis. The other thing that's relatively unique in the U.S. market at this point in time is that we have a normal amount or a limited amount of manufacturers, typically 500 to 1,000, depending upon where you look for a source of people putting product into the supply chain. There's roughly only about 150 distributors in the middle of the supply chain in the United States, and 3 or 4 to 5 of those distributors amount to about 90% of the market. So it's got a very tight middle, and then when you get below that, you get into 65,000 pharmacies, 2,500 hospitals, that kind of stuff. So somewhat a modest amount here, very tight in the middle, much larger in the bottom, and a lot of those transactions then flow through the distributors in the process. Whoop, that is really a sensitive clicker, isn't it? There we go. Okay, so in 2017, the barcoding requirements kick in for the manufacturers to begin putting the new 2D data matrix on the package. And that particular initiative largely will miss the impact on the distributors. We do not have an obligation to do anything with that barcode beginning in 2017. It's the date that the manufacturers must begin affixing it. They can still sell through old product that they may have packaged before that particular point in time, but the distributors from an impact perspective are largely out of the 2017 requirements. We do have a requirement that comes up on us in 2019, which to many in the industry was some of an aha moment, a little bit of a surprise, which is beginning in 2019, we have to use that new barcode to verify returns before we can restock them. Now, as we started to talk to our trading partners, we would first go out and say, we're looking ahead at 2019. We need to talk about verification and how we're going to do that. And some of our trading partners would say things like, well, I'm a manufacturer, and our policy is we don't take returns, therefore there's no problem because there aren't any. I went, well, wait a minute, time out. Behind the scenes, we were able to identify that across the industry, there's roughly around 60 million pieces of returned product a year that come from the pharmacies back to the distributors. Manufacturers may or may not be aware that that activity is happening because the distributors have been recirculating that inventory for a long time. And now when we get to the verification model, we have a connectivity issue where how is the distributor going to verify that and be able to look at that number and confirm that the information is correct without doing something to connect to the manufacturer. So even though on the early end of it, the manufacturers did not believe 2019 was a challenge for them, Peggy, as a matter of fact, did not have 2019 verification on her slide as one of the big goals I noticed earlier. It is something that we have to address with the manufacturers in order to be successful. The other thing that happens in 2019, and I'll talk about this a little bit more a little later on, is there's a clause in the law that says a distributor in 2019 can no longer transact a product that does not have a 2D data matrix barcode on it. Now, if you look at the word transact and you start to look around for definitions, one of the things that you find is that the FDA in some of their literature that they've discussed this as means buy and sell. And that means at some point in time, suddenly, everything you're bringing into your building should have a 2D barcode on it, but anything you already have that doesn't have it can't leave your building because you can't sell through it. So we have some issues with some of the language that's in the law, and we're trying to figure out how we're going to address that on a go-forward basis. that one worked. Okay, so I talked about returns verification a little bit. This does begin in November of 2019. There are actually 2 tests that a distributor has to do on a product before we can restock it and put it back in stock. First test is fairly straightforward for us. It's an internal test, and that internal test is simply to mean we have to go find the original traceability information when we sold that product to a customer, and we have to be able to associate that with the product being returned. So we have to confirm truly it was an item we sold and that we have the relevant data for it. We can meet the first test and move on, and that's an entirely internal process. The second test is a verification. And this afternoon in the breakout, I'm going to talk about the HDA returns pilots that were done. We looked at a variety of different ways to be able to do verification, but we need to be able to take the information that's encoded on the product and compare it to the information the manufacturer assigned to that particular product identifier. That could be done in-house, that could be done out-of-house, but it does create almost a de facto exchange of information somehow with the manufacturer in 2019, even though the ultimate serialization traceability implementation doesn't occur until 2023. So we have to work through that. The breakout this afternoon, we'll talk about the 9 models we looked at, the 4 that we did live pilots on, the 2 that ultimately I think came out to be our primary winners in that process. A lot of people in this room were involved in that, but returns verification is very unique to something that the distributors have to begin in 2019 with the participation of the manufacturer partners. Now, I said earlier, 2017, the distributors did not have an obligation to do much with the 2D data matrix barcode. It tends to be an issue where manufacturers are fixing it. But one of the interesting things with barcodes is that it's not enough just to put the data onto the package. Somebody else has to be able to scan that package and understand what that information means and be able to interpret that. It is truly a language that you have to be able to know and understand. So we're starting to look at what is being coded onto the product, and we're starting to look inside our own systems as to how we're going to be able to ultimately integrate that into the software. As Peggy outlined, we're looking for an NDC number integrated into a GTIN format. That sounds fairly straightforward. There are a lot of complications with that because we see NTINs in some countries, we see true GTINs in some countries, and the US is looking for an NTIN type structure with that NDC number embedded inside there. We are having products that are coming into our buildings already, and even though we are not yet using the barcodes for any purpose, when I pick it up off the shelf and I look at it, I see printed on our front of the package, this is the NDC number of that product. My expectation would be when I turn it around and look at the human readable barcode, I would see that number embedded somewhere in that GTN 14, and I'm finding different numbers in the GTN 14. So that's going to be a challenge for us because that doesn't quite meet the letter of what the US is looking for in the DSCSA. We're looking for the serial number, the expiry, the lot batch, and we've been playing around with some of this in some of the pilots that have been done in the near future, and I would define near future. Jeff, I don't know when your scan project is it the next 4 weeks or so? Ours is also in the next 4 weeks. So ABC, McKesson, and GS1 US are going to do 2 warehouse scans. We're going to scan a specialty warehouse from one end to the next as much as we can, and we're going to scan a pharma warehouse from one end to the next. And the purpose is to gather what details are on the products today, how many products are barcoded, what formats are the barcodes that are on there, and to the extent that's possible, to compare the values that we see encoded in the barcode with the expected values that we would think should be encoded in there. And we want to set a baseline kind of to see how this conversion process is going. Then later on in the year, shortly after November, we're expecting that we're going to do it again at that point. Hopefully we'll see a huge uptick in the number of 2D data barcodes that we see. But then we also will look at it again sometime into next year to see if the old inventory is aging its way out of the system. Our goal is a couple-fold here. It's to be able to look at those 2D barcodes and see if we have any just quality issues that may cause problems for the scanners and the systems, but also be able to look and see if there's anybody that we could perhaps give an early aha to or an early heads up that there's something different going on than what we might have expected. That issue I mentioned with the NDC not being embedded in the GTIN is a classic example. If we can get to somebody early, perhaps they can correct that before there's a lot of product out in the supply chain that is not marked the way we would expect it to be. I already briefly mentioned the NDC not being embedded in there. One of the other things that we have come across as distributors, that's been a bit of an aha for us, was we've been starting to do some work with the barcode itself for those that have barcodes on them. This was in the pilots. We were doing some sample data transmissions back and forth between the distributors and the manufacturers as part of a returns verification. excuse me, I have been a little bit hoarse lately, but as part of our returns verification, and we came across a problem with formats of dates. And this one was fairly subtle, but it turned out to be a rather challenging issue for us because in the 2D data matrix barcode, it's perfectly acceptable to put 00 in the day field. You know, the data matrix construct allows you to do that. When you turn around and attempt to transmit data similar to that through the EPCIS system, EPCIS is based on XML, and it right away goes, whoop, wait a minute, you can't put 00 in a date field in an XML file. It has to be an actual logical date. So we would scan the barcode, we'd send the data up, it would either fail in transmission, or if we did find a way to get the data transmitted up, we would get a negative response back from some of the manufacturers saying, my computer software doesn't have anything in SAP that has a 00 in a day field, and we'd get a mismatch. So some of the system processes between EPCIS and the 2D data matrix are not currently aligned, and it's something we're going to have to address. And I think in the GS1 US implementation guide, there's a recommendation that we ask, if you can, to put a real date in the barcode so it will match your EPCIS transmissions when you start sending them later. So this is kind of my, it's not going to help. It's been 3 days already. This is the shouting while you're drinking wine in the cocktail reception. The bad food on the airplane. It's a culmination of problems. Maybe a little nervousness for being at the grown-up table. So I mentioned this one earlier, the cannot transact language in the law. You see where they have the manufacturers beginning affixing the 2D in November of 17. The repackagers begin affixing. The assumption is that they can continue to sell through old stock, and there's nothing that I see in the DSCSA that says they can't. The distributors get that cannot transact language in 2019, and it really doesn't make a lot of sense because if you look then at the dispensers have a clear line in the law that says in 2020 they can't buy product without the new barcode. And you have to scratch your head and wonder who's going to sell it to them because a distributor can't sell it after 2019. So there's some language issues we need to get understood with the FDA. If the FDA comes ahead and publishes a grandfathering guidance, and I say if because there are a lot of other guidances we're looking for, we may be able to address this. But in the absence of them publishing anything, we're stuck with the statutory language. We have a challenge with that. So we need to really understand from the FDA what, if any, guidance they're going to allow us. So that's pretty much a distributor snapshot. This is my contact information. I believe these materials get emailed out to you at the end of the day. So if you have any questions for me, feel free to give me an email and let me know. I deliberately did not put a phone number on here because I never know where I am. So it's better to get a hold of me by email. I will also give you a reminder that during the breakouts after lunch, you'll have the opportunity to come into one of the breakouts if you wish. Peggy will be there, I will be there, and Jeff will be there, and we're going to do a little bit of a different flavor and a deeper dive. I'm going to cover the returns verification pilots that HDA did and walk you through that. They're going to, I think Jeff's covering EPCIS, and we're going to have some more information, so feel free to look us up for that. With that, I'll turn it over to Mr. Jeffrey Denton.